I'd now like to invite Dr. Sarah Lawley to discuss Australia's electricity grid. Dr. Lawley is a physicist with a PhD from the University of Adelaide, with 2 decades of experience working in technical and management roles in mining and energy. Can you please welcome Sarah to talk to us about our energy grid?
Thanks, Jazz. Thanks, everyone. What I'm going to talk about today is obviously Australia's electricity system and the journey so far. And when I'm talking about the journey there, I'm talking about decarbonisation and some of the challenges that we've sort of hit along that journey, a way forward in terms of looking at how we can better understand the puzzle of what we need to do and how we can make good decisions. So I'd say where we started on the decarbonisation journey is well characterised by the words of Professor Garnaut. He said, "A reduction in emissions matters more than what a country pays for it. A reduction in emissions matters more than what a country pays for it." This is where we were at the start of our decarbonisation journey, I think. And so what did we do? Australia started to decarbonise the grid using solar and wind. So this is a chart sort of showing the history of the composition of the generation sources in the national electricity market. About 15 years ago, it was predominantly coal and gas, which is represented by the black and orange here, with a component of hydro. And that reflects, I guess, that this is a dry country. We don't have a lot of hydro sort of opportunities naturally occurring, but we do have a lot of coal and gas. And so that's, at the time, or in earlier years, was the most efficient way for Australia to produce electricity for its needs. So, but we've been on this decarbonisation journey. About 15 years ago, we introduced the mandatory renewable energy target in order to bring in solar and wind, which obviously don't have the same emissions as their other sources, whereas the coal and gas. What that target means, what that scheme was, is that if you're a wind farm or a solar farm and you generate electricity dispatch into the grid, that for every megawatt hour that you generate, you receive a renewable energy certificate. And these certificates have a very high value. In fact, across the history of that scheme, most of the time actually, probably, but I haven't looked at the exact specifics, but a lot of the time, the renewable energy certificates were worth more than the dispatch-weighted value of the electricity, so the value at the spot price. Now, at the moment, they're still worth about $50 per megawatt hour. So if you generate as a wind farm or a solar farm, and to an extent hydro as well, you receive those certificates. The reason they have so much value is the mandatory part of the mandatory renewable energy target. So what that is that retailers are required to surrender a certain percentage of certificates based on what was their total customer load for the prior calendar year, and a percentage of that they have to somehow obtain either by generation or by buying the certificates from others who've generated. They need to then surrender those certificates to the Clean Energy Regulator. So the scheme's been actually very successful because obviously that value, if you're an investor thinking about building something, you're going to be getting that extra revenue stream other than just what the other generators were getting, which is just the spot price from the operator when they're dispatching. So it was quite successful in incentivising that wind and solar. And what you can see in this chart, which is from OpenNEM website, if you ever want any data on Australia's electricity grid, have a look at that site. What this is made up of, the green obviously is the wind, the solar contains both rooftop solar, which is the bulk of it, but also utility scale solar. And when we've got to 2023, as of 2023, If you include solar, wind and hydro, we were up to almost 40% renewables by last year, with the remainder, a bit over 60%, being coal and gas. And we'd met that target, so that renewable energy target's the first one on this list of targets I'm showing here, which is in the national energy laws. That target was met through that scheme, but we have a lot of other emissions targets and renewable energy targets, which are the federal ones and various state targets, etc. And they're all now, as of last year, captured in the national energy laws. And this is I'm just showing one page, but there's several pages of targets in terms of emissions targets and renewable energy targets. And we look at the second one on the list there after the one that's already been met. That's that target of 82% renewables by 2030, which you might have heard of. Now, under these national energy laws, the Australian Energy Market Operator, when they produce their integrated system plan, which they do every couple of years, that system plan must meet those targets. So they actually work out, I guess, a plan going forward over the next, actually out to 2050, that's designed to meet those targets, or constrained to meet those targets. Now, if you take the example of that 82% renewables by 2030, and you have a think about what that actually means, that actually also means 18% fossil fuels by 2030. So in 5 and a bit years, that we would go from 60% fossil fuels down to 18% fossil fuels. Now, in order for AEMO to produce a plan that enables that to be possible without, and still have maintain reliability, they have to postulate they have to introduce a lot of storage into that plan. And they've been quite heavily criticised for, the purple wedge there, which is shown in that chart of installed capacity, which shows the storage requirement that would be needed if you were to reduce the fossil fuels to the extent that is required to meet our targets. That coordinated CER means coordinated consumer energy resources. So it means that people buy electric vehicles and house batteries, and that they use them in such a way that suits the grid, so that they charge them during solar hours perhaps, and but then in the evenings they discharge their electric vehicles or house batteries so that it works in a coordinated way. So it's a huge amount. You can see Snowy 2.0, which is a massive, massive hydro project. It's the little dark blue section at the bottom of that storage chart, so 2 gigawatts. But they're talking about getting towards 60 gigawatts, so a lot of Snowy 2.0s. But be fair to them, because they're required to meet those targets when they create that plan. So if you don't think the plan's realistic, they probably don't either. It's just that they're required to produce it in that way. But the reality is that renewable energy investment has slowed. And this is a chart showing the last 5 years, and you can see sort of a downward trend in the number of projects and the rolling average capacity being added in megawatts, which is the yellow line there. So not many projects have been getting through the pipe as such, getting through the pipeline. And this is also something else published by the Australian Energy Market Operator, which is the Electricity Statement of Opportunities. And you can see there that last year's Statement of Opportunities is showing that there's basically, there's 100 times as much, roughly 100 times as much proposed wind and solar versus, or proposed generation, I should say, versus what's actually in commissioning. So the pipe is quite blocked, or it has been very blocked. Recently, Jeff Dimery gave a speech at the Press Club, and he summarised this situation by saying the reason why renewable energy investment was stalled is due to higher costs and uncertainty about recovering those costs. So the higher costs is is supply chain issues, cost of capital, that sort of stuff. The uncertainty about recovering those costs is due to a number of different issues. So there's a problem with price. This is looking at the last 12 months in Victoria, which is particularly challenged in this respect. And it shows you, if you look at those prices sort of for the different types of generation, it shows you that the dispatch-weighted prices of solar and wind are actually very low. So if you're thinking about investing, these are the sort of numbers you've got to think about in terms of, well, how much are you going to be earning in dollars per megawatt hour for your generation if you spend money and build this thing? And $20 a megawatt hour for utility solar is not enough to justify it. You will be getting those renewable energy certificates, but that scheme ends in 2030 because it had kind of, I guess, eaten itself and come to the end of its tether. And so that's not going to be enough to make you feel confident that you'll earn enough money to pay off your loan for building your solar farm. And the same is true of wind. $35 per megawatt hour is not enough. So hence there's a problem with price. There's also a problem with volume. If you're thinking of building a wind farm or a solar farm, already last year the average wind and solar curtailment was at 9.3%. And this is made up of economic curtailment, where wind or solar farms choose to turn down because the prices in the spot market are negative, and so they'll be losing money if they generate, so they choose to. That's shown in yellow in that chart. And the red is showing where the operator actually constrains the assets because basically the market's flooded. There's too much solar and wind at that time in the grid or in that area. Now, a lot of people think we just need more transmission and that will alleviate this issue of curtailment. But in practice, the curtailment is happening in all states at the same time. So in this chart, you can see sort of, obviously the solar farm curtailment happens during solar hours. This is just a random sample of 3 weeks of data, but the point of it is to sort of show that the different colours represented on the chart is actually showing the different states around Australia. So you can see that where these curtailed amounts are occurring in every state at the same time, it means, yes, if you had excess solar, say for example in South Australia, and you thought you could send it to Sydney and that they would want it, you would find that actually no, they're curtailing as well, and they're also not wanting, they would love to send it back to you. So it is an issue in terms of thinking about it like that. If you had a simplistic idea that you could just add more transmission lines and it would solve it, it's not the case. Curtailment impacts mostly, like the worst impact is on solar farms because they're competing directly with rooftop solar. And secondly, wind farms, because they can't choose when it's windy. So that's a couple of issues to take into consideration around what's the uncertainty about recovering costs. So those are the types of uncertainty. It's price and it's volume. And this is why, I guess, that late last year, the decision was made to stop using the renewable energy target and to introduce something called the capacity investment scheme, which is a sort of a replacement scheme which doesn't operate through the market. It kind of operates around the market, that if generators aren't earning enough revenue through their participation in the spot market, then there's a guarantee that essentially the taxpayer or the government will top them up if they fall below a floor. So that scheme has sort of come in, that capacity investment scheme, to an extent to replace really the renewable energy target, which was starting to produce perverse outcomes. So I think it's important that we understand what are the ingredients that we've been using to decarbonise in Australia, because I guess early in the piece, we decided we wanted to decarbonise, and we decided that we wanted to use wind and solar. And back then we didn't think about what would that involve, how much would that cost, are there other alternatives, is this actually the best way to decarbonise? Back when we started the scheme, we didn't assess that, we didn't compare the alternatives. And I think the best way to do this is probably replicated in many countries around the world, that they've essentially gone in this direction without assessing it beforehand, is because they didn't really understand the pieces of the puzzle. So I'm just going to share some more data, and it is just the data that I happen to pull when I open up the app or open up the site, and there's nothing particularly special about any particular week that you might pull out. But what I'm showing here is a week of wind output across the national electricity market from the 4th of April to the 10th of April, just to give you a feel for what it looks like. In real time, wind generation looks like a mountainscape. It has valleys and it has peaks. That's the nature of wind, and this is across the whole grid. I used to work for a company called Meridian Energy Australia. That was, when I moved into electricity, that was the first company I worked for. And we had a wind farm on the Eyre Peninsula of South Australia, and a wind farm in Victoria, and ultimately we had other assets around the NEM. But we would always find this situation where you do get valleys and mountains. And solar, of course, looks like teeth. You can have little jagged teeth or you can have really pointy teeth, but it always looks like teeth because it's always in solar hours. So if we combine these shapes, if we combine these for this particular week, and by the way, you can pick any week you like, and you can do it yourself. You can grab the data from that site, that OpenNEM, and you'll find the same conclusion. It doesn't matter which week you pick. So what I'm showing here is the combination of wind and solar in the orange there for this particular week, and the blue is showing the load, the electricity load across the NEM in real time. What does it look like? This is a really boring week. There was no heat wave, there was no cold snap, there's nothing interesting about it. But you might think, okay, there's a little bit of correlation between the fact that we use more electricity during the day because we're awake, and solar happens during the day, so that's good. So maybe we should scale up this and have more renewable energy and see if that sort of meets our requirements. So I've just done this as a sort of a dummy exercise, which is, imagine if you just had 3 times as much. So you had 3 times as much in terms of utility solar, wind farms, and rooftop solar. You find that you end up with quite a bad mismatch for this particular week. Of course, you will always have a mismatch if you do this. Like it's because electricity demand doesn't behave like renewable energy. People worry a lot about the gaps where there's not enough power in terms of the orange line being below the blue line. People get very concerned about that because they're worried about blackouts and things like that. But you can actually find ways to generate to firm the grid. You can, for example, have gas-fired power plants which can run whenever you want, so you can fill up those gaps. They might not run economically, but they will do the job in terms of preventing blackouts. But I think when people look at this picture, they might not realise that commercially the problem is the spikes poking out above, which was what I mentioned before around curtailment, that if you don't have, well, to the extent that you don't have storage, those spikes need to be curtailed. So energy companies, for example, who always act commercially, wouldn't build this system because there'd be such great losses in terms of that level of curtailment, unless there was a lot of storage and you could move those spikes into the patches that are blank. Keep in mind though, if you optimise this for this one particular week, it probably wouldn't be right for another week that happens 3 weeks later or 3 months later. So, so you don't want to optimise your whole grid for this particular week. It's just an example. But you might look at this and say, well, Sarah, but you've stuffed up because you've put too much solar and not enough wind for this particular week, because clearly those spikes, they're no good. That's big losses. So what about if we keep all the solar the same? So no more rooftop solar, no more solar farms, and just scale up the wind, just for the purpose of illustration. So here's an example. So if we do that, we're still, basically, there's no combination of wind and solar that's load following. You always have this issue of that sometimes you've got not enough, sometimes you've got too much, and it really needs storage to sort that out. Now, some people say, but what about, why don't we use that excess power, the excess solar, those spikes that were in the last chart, or the lumps that are kind of poking out in this, the peaks that are poking out in this example, and why don't we use that excess to make hydrogen or to make methanol? Why don't we make use of it and we can be, you know, a superpower with the excess if we've got so much of it? But the problem with it is, the reason why we don't use excess wind and solar to make hydrogen or methanol is because these types of processes are optimised with continuous 24/7 electricity. Essentially, if you build something that makes methanol, a big shiny plant, and you put in a lot of capex, and it needs to be doing things like boiling water and putting things through membranes and distilling and whatever it's doing, this is just an example of methanol. I don't have any technical experience with it, but I know that with any kind of processing plant, if you've spent all this money, the best way to optimise the revenue from that plant would be to have continuous supply of electricity so that you can continuously produce the product so that you can sell the maximum amount of that product per unit time of operating that facility. So intermittency is a problem for things like hydrogen or methanol. You're in practice not going to turn it on when the sun comes up and turn it off when the sun goes down. And I think to an extent this is why, you know, hydrogen's not working out. There's been huge amounts of announcements. This is reported by the International Energy Agency last year, and I think of all the announcements, a small fraction of them is still sort of on the table. And I would say that even this chart's probably out of date now, because since then, I think there've been a few of even Andrew Forrest's projects that he didn't, that haven't reached financial close, etc. So that orange bit's probably even shrinking. And it is because hydrogen needs electricity that is low cost and 24/7 to be viable. And renewable energy doesn't provide 24/7 low cost power. So it's never too late to make good decisions from where you are. And I think, you know, a recent survey by the CSIRO sort of came to the conclusion that most people were unwilling to pay more or risk blackouts for a faster transition. What that reflects, I think, is people are starting to really think about it more and kind of take a step back, because we did sort of plough into this without assessing and comparing alternatives. So expectations are changing. My take on what we need to do now is calculate the full system costs. Yeah, sorry, I've been a bit slow. And minimise all the things that I think other people will cover very well in this workshop, so I don't need to list all the things that we need to consider. It's not just cost, it's actually not just emissions either. There's lots of things that we need to consider in optimising the system, and we need to do a full comparison. We also, I will mention, we do need to consider the financial outcomes of market participants when we do planning. Because if you don't take it into account, you end up paying them outside the system in some other way. If it's not the consumer of electricity that's paying for whatever their commercial requirements are, it ends up being the taxpayer. So you need to consider the full financial outcomes in comparing systems. On that picture, I also wanted to say that you might feel like we're in that pit sometimes, like we're extending coal plants and we're struggling to get investment, etc. Various things are, every now and then we have a blackout or a system black or something. We're having a lot of issues and you might feel like we're in that pit sometimes. But that picture is a fractal and you're always at the start. You always have a choice of where you are now, the decisions that you make now. So you always want to make the best decisions now. Just to summarise quickly, I'm getting in trouble with Jazz. We chose an approach before really assessing it. Renewable energy behaviour is very different to demand. It's qualitatively very different. And it's a good time now to compare our decarbonisation options. I'm just going to say here, and I know that this might be a hard thing for some people, but Australia is not a renewable energy superpower. The physical inefficiency gives rise to a financial inefficiency. And so I think we just need to be honest about that. It's not too late to transparently present the options that we have and to make good decisions from where we are. So proceed expeditiously but prudently.